I'd like to invite the kids to come up here with me, and everyone may be seated. Come on down. We used to say that. Was that Monty Hall? Come on down. Bob Barker. There you go. So we just heard this story about our patron saint, St. John the Baptist. We're the parish of St. John the Baptist. And did you hear at the beginning of that, it said, when John was in prison. Does anybody know why John was in prison? He said some things that got him in trouble. He said that the king and the king's wife were doing bad things by living together. And he said that because the king had taken his brother's wife to be his wife. And John said, you can't do that. That's not right. Well, when you say that's not right to the king, you're liable to get in trouble. So John ended up in the slammer. And I've always been struck by that. It's just sort of a throwaway phrase in our story, but I thought, gosh, that must have been hard for him. He lived out in the wilderness, he had the open skies, and all of a sudden he was in this dank, dark cell. And he probably didn't know what was going to happen to him. Some bad things could happen. Do you know what happened to him eventually? He did die. He was beheaded by the king. And he probably knew that was a possibility. So he's in prison, he has time to think, and he's been preaching about his cousin, Jesus, as being the Messiah, the chosen one of God, but he's beginning to have some doubts. Do you ever have doubts about things? Not sure if you got it right. About school, a lot of doubts. And so he sends two of his followers, his disciples, and tells them, go ask Jesus. Just ask him. Are you the one that I think you are? Are you the one that God has chosen to usher in a new way of us living together? And so I've often thought, it took him a while to go do that, and he, again, must have had a lot of time to think. So when Scott and I began to write this musical about the life of John, I knew when we got to this part of the story, I wanted to take a moment and have a song about what he might have been thinking. Because I think he was probably reflecting over his whole life. If you think your life might end sometime soon, you're probably looking out over the whole thing. And he was probably looking back and thinking about the stories about when he was born. He had an unusual birth to very old parents that were past the age that most people had children. And his father had seen a vision of an angel that said, your wife's going to have a baby, and he sort of doubted that, and he was struck mute. He couldn't speak after he saw that vision. Well, the baby is born, and the people, the relatives and the friends, they say, what are you going to name the child? To his mother. And she says, John, because that's what the angel had said to name him. And they said, you can't name him John. Nobody in your family has that name. Now, that may sound strange now, but in those days, you had to name him after a family member. Preferably the dad, if it was a boy. And she said, no, we're naming him John. She was adamant. And they couldn't believe it, so they turn to his dad, who can't speak, and they say, is this what you want? And he takes a tablet and he writes, his name is John. And when he does that, all of a sudden his mouth is open, he can speak. And he sings this wonderful song in praise, blessing God, and then blessing his newborn son, little John. So I imagine John was thinking back about this. He wouldn't have remembered all this, but he heard the stories probably, and thinking, have I lived up to that? It looks like everything's coming to an end. Have I lived up to the courage that my mother had in giving me an unexpected name? Have I lived up to this blessing that my dad gave me? Now these are just my thoughts. You can wonder on your own what John might have been thinking. But we do know, according to Matthew, that story we just heard, that Jesus wondered about his cousin, John wondered about his cousin Jesus. if he really was the Messiah, if he was God's chosen one. And so he sends, as I said, the disciples away. And today's sermon is going to be in two parts. But before we leave this first part, I want to ask Zach and Scott, our instrumentalists, if they will show us this song that sort of shares what his reflections might be. Okay, can we listen to the song? Great. Thank you, Zach. Thank you very much. So, given this question, and whatever John was doing in prison, it might not sound like great news. You know, we try to preach the good news here on a Sunday morning. But I think there's some good news in it. Because what this tells me is that our patron saint, the great John the Baptist, Jesus said nobody ever born was greater than he. If he can have doubts, if he cannot be sure from time to time, maybe I can have my own doubts and not be sure about things. And it's all right. But the truth is, God doesn't want us to stay in those doubts and unsurety. And so after our prayers, we're going to hear the second part of the story about how we find the surety to our doubts. Thank you.